Mike, you can use this microphone up here. Right? Check that for me, Mike.
Check, check, checkity check. Oh my gosh. This is testing my... Good afternoon, everybody. Here we are on day 2, our second craft talk of Summer Fishtrap. I hope you had a good second session. This is really cool. I was watching a little bit of the video from last night on YouTube, and it's going like this, going back. It looks like something from Hollywood, but it's real. Like I said last night, if you were at the open, I always ask our Summer Fishtrap faculty if they would like to share something extra during the week. Sometimes it's a craft talk. Sometimes it's a panel discussion on a theme. Sometimes it's Laura Pritchett one year really wanted to do a craft talk on how to write great sex scenes, which I had to think about for a while, but then I let her do, and it was great. We've been following Tim. First came to Summer Fishtrap in 2018, I believe, and his evening reading was about his book, All They Will Call You, and everybody was. I mean, he had everybody in it was such a compelling story that we hadn't heard before. Goosebumps, tears, call and response. It was one of the greatest evening faculty readings I had heard. And then a couple of years ago, I told you about my personal signed copy of All They Will Call You and how it ended up somewhere in Europe. If you loan a book or a record, don't expect it to ever come back, even if it has your name in it. It might go greater places than you have ever been. When I heard that Tim was creating a documentary about All They Will Call You based on the books that he's written on the subject, I just asked him, hey, would you show a trailer and talk a little bit about it? And he said yes. So I think this ties in as much to our American story as anything. And so I'm just going to introduce Tim, and we're going to everyone cross their fingers and toes and eyes that the tech will work. And even if it doesn't, Tim just has a compelling story to share with you, and you'll have a chance to interact and ask questions too. So, take it, Tim Z. Hernandez.
Oh, that's for him.
Oh, this is your mic.
Yeah. I thought you were trying to play a trick on me. Thank you all so much. I appreciate being here at Fishtrap, and looking forward to the continuing week with my own workshop, and I'm glad all of you are enjoying your time as well. I want to share first, we're going to show this little it's like a 3.5-minute trailer. I guess you call it a trailer. Really what it was for us is a proof of concept for fundraising purposes. That's what it was. So it's not necessarily the trailer of the story. It's just for proof of concept. But I want to talk a little bit. I want to set it up, what we're going to show, by giving you some context. Since 2010, I've been working on one specific research project, an investigative project. It's based on a 1948 plane crash in which the government was deporting 28 Mexican workers. Their work contracts had expired, and they were being deported by airplane from Oakland down to the San Diego border to be sent back to Mexico. An hour into the flight, the plane crashed, killed everybody aboard, including the 4 American crew members. And the newspaper reports mentioned the names and wrote about the 4 American crew members, but the 28 Mexican passengers were only referred to as deportees. That got picked up by one of our folk heroes, Woody Guthrie. In 1948, he wrote a poem about it. And in his poem, he attempts to assign the passengers names as a way to sort of restore their dignity. He doesn't know their names because they're anonymous at this time, and so he decides to pen, in his lyrics, he writes, "Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, Adios, mis amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be deportee. And that poem got picked up by a musician named Martin Hoffman, who gave it over to Pete Seeger, who gave it to Joan Baez, who gave it to Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen and Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton and Johnny Cash, and everyone under the sun has sung that song over the last 7 decades and plus. So that accident, I didn't know this. In 2010, I was researching for a novel, and in 2010, I came across this newspaper headline about this incident, and I didn't realize it happened in the county that I grew up in California. And so I said, I wonder what happened to the remains of the passengers. I found out that they were buried in what at the time was considered the largest unmarked mass grave in California's history. And it was a couple miles from my home. And when I stood in front of this unmarked mass grave in 2010, I was just, for some reason or another, my curiosity called me into finding out who was buried there. And then when I found out who was buried there and their names, I said, well, the names are just a symbol of who we are. Our stories are what we're made up of. And so I want to know their stories. And I began a long journey that if you had told me at the time would become a lifelong journey, I would have probably said no to this. I didn't know. I just thought, oh, okay, well, I'll find out who they are. Next thing I know, here I am 16 years later. And I've found half of the passengers' families, traveled throughout the United States, all over the United States, looking for their families, and all into central Mexico looking for the families, quite literally knocking on doors, trying to find who they are, and writing their stories into the light. Those stories are what came to be All They Will Call You, the first book. In 2017, it was published. And then They Call You Back in 2024, because they call you back. So where the documentary comes in, and also, too, by the way, once we show the trailer, I'd like to really try and open this up more as a discussion, as a conversation. So any kind of questions or curiosities you have, please feel free. Let's chat about it. I think that's just the best way to go about it. I've been talking all morning to my students in the workshop. So, yeah, let's have a conversation. But this trailer, I just want to kind of tell you, like I said, it was for a proof of concept. And what happened here is that over the last 16 years, I was documenting, not because I thought it was a documentary, but because I was actually just going around taking footage of the research, thinking it might be part of this archive I was creating. And it wasn't until years and years later, my daughter, who when I began this search was 2 years old, and no, that's a lie. She was 6 years old. My son was 2. My daughter was 6 years old at the time, and as she grew up in this story, she ended up becoming a multimedia journalism major at the university where I teach today. And I think it was just the kind of story that was waiting for her to come along and prompt the idea that what I had and accumulated over all these years in footage was in fact the stuff of a documentary. And so she said, look, I'll help you by putting together this first proof of concept trailer, and that'll help you get the funding so that you can make this documentary. And I'd like to talk more about the documentary process after we show this, but she's the one who actually made this when we started all of this, and this was about 2 years ago when she made this. So let's go ahead and show that. All right, so start by just telling me your full name and then also how you're related to both of the passengers.
On January 28, 1948, a government-chartered airplane carrying 28 Mexican citizens back to their homeland crashed in the Los Gatos Canyon near the town of Coalinga in Fresno County.
He heard the people screaming and actually saw them coming out of the plane.
The government made no effort to release their identity. They made no effort to communicate the tragic event with their families. And they made no effort to relocate the remains of these victims to their native country. I rise to recognize an individual whose tireless efforts have led to justice on behalf of the victims of that event.
Brought it out of the shadows and out.
Tim Hernandez.
Writer Tim Z. Hernandez.
Tim Z. Hernandez was just listed as how did you figure out names of the victims?
This mystery are still unsolved.
Because since 2013, my life has been different, and all because all what he did.
Ahí está, tío.
Some of us illegal and some are unwanted. Said some of us illegal and most are unwanted. It's 600 miles to Mexican border.
Tim Hernandez did the work that the government should have done, but 70 years later.
You ask where these friends all scattered like dry leaves. Your causes all just before me. Goodbye to my one, goodbye Rosalita. Adios mi amigos, Jesus Maria. No, you won't have a name when we ride the big airplane. All they will call us is searching for me.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Oh, there's John Boomer. Yeah, and I think what I was planning on just chatting about was just really the process of going from book to documentary. You know, like I said, a real big sort of, I think a big spark for that was the coming of age of my own daughter, growing up with this story, and then looking at it through that perspective, because until that moment, I really only saw what I was, you know, my own investment was as an author. And that was, I think that's important to talk about, because even when I early on was documenting some of the footage of these families as I was finding them, early on I was a one-man show with my own cameras and my own, sometimes it's a cell phone, whatever you had with you at the time, because like I said originally, I wasn't thinking of it as a documentary, I was looking at it as just documentation. But I also had the sort of state of mind to go, I need to collect everything. There's no archive in this research. I have to create it as I go. So I was writing down notes, you know, taking photographs with and it's just a one-man show basically. And it wasn't until years later that once she started to understand cameras and videography, I started to get followed around with different cameras and audio, because Dad, sound is like the most important thing. Oh, okay. I mean, you know. So I started to learn a lot of these things in the process. But something also interesting happened in 2017 when All They Will Call You came out. The book was optioned for a film by, I was approached by different producers that wanted to turn it into a film. And I ended up signing on with one, and we spent about 6 years in development as a narrative, as a scripted film. So I wrote the adaptation for the script with the director. There was a lot of work happening. And something in that process continued to kind of haunt me a little bit. And it was that in a narrative film, there's less control than there is in a documentary film, at least as the author, as the person searching or the person putting the story together. And then they also had to sort of latch on onto like one or two main stories versus it just kind of really got condensed, as you can imagine, you know. And that bothered me. It was part of the compromise, but it still never sat well with me. And I kept thinking, well, I have the books. I'm working on the books, and that tells the true story of their lives and all that. But finally, when the option expired in 23, I decided at that point, it was in 23, that I said, you know what? I'm not going to renew the option with this production company. I'm going to explore it. And by then I had several meetings, years of meetings by then, with different producers and filmmakers. And I started to understand some of those dynamics. And it was a friend of mine, a filmmaker friend of mine named Carlos Avila. He's a great filmmaker based out of LA. He's done some great films. Most recently, his film's called The Kill Floor. And he told me one day, he said, you know what? You have all the stuff to turn this into a documentary. I think you should listen to what your daughter's telling you. And so I said, as long as you're one of the consultants, I think I'll be emboldened to move in that direction. And then he said, yeah. And then he introduced me to a few other people. And I think this is something really important when you're writing books, but also in this process. And that's that you create a community around you. I like to think of it as the sort of in indigenous terms, we call it the caracol, the circle, the spiral of people we bring into the journey, who become part of this story. And I did the books that way. To me, the books were written in community. I wanted all the families who were part of the process to feel proud of the final result, so that they became sort of mouthpieces for their own story and pushed it out into the world. And so I thought, let's continue that idea into this process of filmmaking. So it was gathering the right people along the way who already felt invested in this story, who knew this story, some who followed my journey since the beginning through social media. And I ended up sort of bringing them in as consultants in the project. And now we're at the stage now where, since it's been going on, 23, we started to do the real legwork of turning this into a documentary. And now we're just a few months away, probably. I think we're aiming at early October to finish the project. We're doing some final fundraising for it right now. And you can find all this information, more of the details, on my website at timzhernandez.com. But that's where we're at in the process right now. It's been really interesting. And what I wanted to kind of do is just have a discussion about books to film, specifically in my experience, the documentary world. But even a little bit of the knowledge of working through the book option and working on the scripts and things like that as well. It's kind of an interesting journey. But does anyone have any questions about what you saw, or the story itself, or the investigative aspect of the books, anything like that? I'm happy to chat about. Yes. Thank you. How did I get warmed up to talking to people? That's important to say, I think, too, because I didn't go to school for investigative journalism. My focus was poetry. I studied poetry at Naropa in Boulder, Colorado, and I studied poetry at Bennington College in Vermont. So my focus was always poetry. Obviously, poetry has its own investigative, poets are also curious. I think it's safe to say about all writers. But for me, what happened was I think I was really paying attention to some of the more investigative poets. Ed Sanders has a wonderful series of books called The America, A History in Verse, in which I'll never forget, I attended, as an undergraduate, I attended one of his talks, and he said, here's the thing, is he said, each of you, I challenge you to go out and become the leading expert on one subject. Whatever that subject is in your life, become the expert on that subject and follow it for as long as you go. Like, continue to write about it, talk about it, learn about it. And I love that idea. I didn't have any clue as to what that subject would be for myself, but years later, when this suddenly sort of arrived at my feet, I just found myself curiously following it. And now I think back to those early beginnings of poets I was looking at for that kind of inspiration. C.D. Wright has some wonderful poetry, too, in which he investigates and writes about it. Mark Nowak, who writes about the Coal Mountain Elementary. David Mason, who writes about the miners and what was that place called? Ludlow, the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado. These were poets that I had been already admiring and looking up to for their investigative approach to a subject, and then remaining inside of that subject for years and years. So the answer is I was very green and very naively going into first interviews with people, no clue. And what almost scared me off from this project was the first time I found one of the families, the first family I found. I wasn't prepared that when I was opening, that what I was actually opening the door to was decades of grief that had been held in. And I'm the first one to knock on the door and say, hey, would you like to talk about this? And what spilled out scared me initially. And then there were many times where I didn't know what I was supposed to do in that situation. Do I keep asking questions? It felt just so cold to continue to ask questions when I could see their grief so palpable on the surface. And then later on, as years passed, it occurred to me that I think I just represented an opportunity for them, an opportunity to share their story, possibly for some an opportunity for closure, or an opportunity for knowledge, for information. So every time I approached a family, I didn't look at it anymore as I was going in to gather something. I looked at it like I was coming to offer something, and it was up to them to decide to want to take that or not. Sometimes it was just information. Some families, I'd bring newspaper reports of what happened to their relative, things like that. They'd ask me questions, I'd ask them questions. So it became very organic in that way. As long as I thought of it as an offering every time I showed up. I'm here to give something, not to take anything. And I'll actually read a little bit about that from tonight at the reading. The excerpt I'll be reading is from that. Yeah. Yeah, you had a question. Thank you. Yeah, I do use different forms in the writing of both of those books. You know, for me, writing is always, I try to keep it as organic as possible. And what I mean by that is I try and let the subject tell me what it needs to be. If I'm paying attention to it and I'm being sort of true to the experience, the presence with that subject, whatever it is, it starts to determine for me what it is. Now, I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So early on, when I first began this research, everything was in fragments. I mean, just like a plane crash, like you would come upon a plane crash 7 decades later, 70 years later, what you're finding is fragments of stuff, right? And so I thought, well, what's the form that allows fragmentation to shine? Poetry. You know, in poetry, you can just use juxtapositions. There is no transition. You can just leap from image to image, idea to idea. So I thought initially, this is a book of investigative poetics. So I'm going to start to piece it together that way. I'd find pieces of newspaper articles, you know, whatever it was, a report, and I'd pull language from that. And I was thinking of like Charles Reznikov, who wrote about, you know, the Nuremberg trials. And I was thinking of all these wonderful poets who I aspired to be. And I was piecing together bits of information. That was the initial thought. But then when I found the first family, 2 years into the research, and I sat down with them for the first time, and they poured their hearts out, and I'd listened to about 2.5 hours of their stories. I went home, because I had it recorded, I transcribed it all, and I thought, these folks have been waiting 70 years to tell their story. They're going to need much more than my white space and fancy positioning of language. They're going to need to just go, go, go. So I began to say, okay, then just keep writing large chunks of their transcriptions. And then the other thing I allowed myself to do is when someone tells you a story, and I mean this applies to all of us, we can't help but see that in our mind's eye. The story starts to unravel. We can see it taking shape, you know, we can see the characters, we can see the setting. Whether it's accurate or not is besides the point. The point is our mind envisions those things automatically. And so I allowed myself to write that also. I'd go home and go, the way I saw it was when he was telling me this, and I'd write it that way, which then became a sort of a reenactment, right? With a very vague reenactment, because I didn't have any more information than my imagination and what they told me. So there were the idea was accumulating language, bringing in language from the documents, language from testimonies, language from my own imagination. And I started to just say, I don't know what the story is going to demand or what it's going to be about, but let all these pieces of language exist side by side, keep gathering. And after years of gathering it all, I kind of looked at it all and thought, now I got to make choices. And in All They Will Call You, I didn't include any of my search in that at all. It stays only in the 40s and talks just about the passengers. And I ended up deciding that that narrative of my search isn't necessary yet, or if it ever will be. And that's how I pieced the book together, was thinking of just the families and all that. And it wasn't until years later, after that book was published, and I chatted with folks like you all, that the questions were always about the search, and the people wanted to know about the investigative aspect. So when I decided to write the second book, it was then the other side of the story, the journey of finding the families, looking for them. So for me, that's why it ends up becoming this hybrid book of various types of narrative. So you have some, when the names, when the airplane breaks apart, I'm using pieces of the actual accident report. I'm using eyewitnesses' accounts from the newspaper articles, looking up at the airplane falling apart, and then I'm spinning this sort of reenactment, fictionalization of what it might have looked like from inside the airplane. Now, here's the thing: is you can do that in nonfiction if you're signaling to the reader that this is what you're doing, And then I look to a lot of great writers who just do that so masterfully. They're giving you a nonfiction story, and suddenly you're going, "How am I in this fictional world suddenly? Where did that happen?" And sometimes it's just with one word, perhaps, and suddenly you're spinning into this other fictional space. But the reason why I did that is because I also wanted to create for the reader I really wanted them to feel this three-dimensional sort of aspect to the characters and who they were. And I wrote the reenactment portions with the families. So I would talk to the families about Guadalupe's character and the things. These are over years of interviews, by the way. How did Guadalupe respond to the great, when their wells there was a big drought in his farm, and how did he respond? What was his person like? How did he move about? Who did he look to for help? These were the things that the families still carried with them, those parts of the stories, and they shared these things with me. So I would talk to them about the plane crash, interview the pilots who've flown that airplane. I wrote the entire plane crash description from sitting inside a Douglas DC-3 airplane, looking out the windows of the cockpit, looking out the windows of, doing as best as I could to create a reenactment, not just a fictionalization for fiction's sake. But so there are these different sort of hybrid, approach to narrative. That's the answer to that. Yes, your question. Not overtly. For me, my writing isn't, I think, overtly political in that way. Because I think that there's a lot of great writers that I look to who do that. One who is actually a Fishtrap alum, also Luis Alberto Urrea, who does that so masterfully, gives us the politics, and as well as makes it contemporary and all that. I'm standing on those shoulders. But the reason why, too, is that I come from a humanities background. I worked in years for the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I listened to the power of oral histories and storytelling from community members just sitting with folks. And I feel like what's missing from that larger conversation is the human element. So to me, I'm going, if I just focus this story on the people, who they loved, how they loved, what they did for that love, and I mean, I'm talking about the pilot, the co-pilot, the stewardess, and the 28 Mexicans who were in. If I just do that, if I elevate their humanity altogether, then I think we see by that example what's missing in this conversation. And I kind of leave it at that, yeah. And I try to do the documentary that way. That's the approach for the documentary also. Because trust me, there is so much of a tendency to go, how do we comment on what's happening? And then we go, well, do we do that? Then it becomes something else. Or do we keep it here, what's missing from the larger conversation? And as much as possible, I try and keep it over here. Yeah. Another question. His question is, how did I track down the families? Yeah, mostly all me. And here's how. It's, again, very naive. But the beauty is that I knew what I didn't know. So, and I was emboldened by Woody Guthrie's words also. In his song, This Land Is Your Land, which we all know, when I went to the crash site for the first time, there was a sign there It said no trespassing. And I thought of Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land lyrics, in which he says, I saw a sign there, it said no trespassing, but on the other side it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. And I said, I hear you, Woody. And I climbed through. And I pretty much used that sort of that approach to a lot of it. And I say that because rather naively going about it, going, well, I don't know what the protocol would be if I were, say, an investigative journalist, but I'm not. I'm just a curious soul asking questions, and that's what I kept going with. The first approach was I went to, after 2 years of searching and not on my own, this was mostly through the internet, by the way, at the time early on, because I didn't know how else to approach it. I went to a friend of mine, because I couldn't find anyone, who is a journalist for the leading bilingual newspaper in Central California, the Farmlands. And I said, will you do this story, talk about it in 2 languages, and then put my phone number and say I'm looking for families? And he said, sure, I'll do that. And he knew, too, it was a long shot, because a lot of the families were here on work visas, and they were being flown back home. So what are the odds that any of their families would be in California 70 years later? So the newspaper comes out. It's called Vida en el Valle. It's in the San Joaquin Valley. It comes out one day, and then it's only one of those weekly newspapers. So it comes out on a Wednesday, and then I'm waiting. I'm thinking excitedly, oh, someone's going to call me. Someone's going to contact me pretty soon here. And then a week passes, and then a second week passes, and then a third week passes. And by then I'm going, yeah, it was a nice try, though, you know. And late one night, going into the 4th week, I get an email, and it says, Mr. Hernandez, I just got this newspaper article. I am the nephew and grandson of 2 of the passengers on that airplane. I've known about this story growing up since I was a kid. And when I first came to California, I had 2 things with me, my backpack with 1 change of clothes, and this old letter my grandpa had sent home about months before he crashed in this plane crash. And I wanted to find out where he was buried to let my family back home finally know. If you'd love to talk to me, give me a call. Anyone here believe in synchronicity? So I call him the next morning, because I get this email like at midnight, but I'm like, I can't call him right now, but I want to call him because it's been like a 2-year search at this point. So finally at 5 in the morning, next day I'm calling him, and I'm like, hi, Mr. Ramirez, this is Tim Hernandez. I got your email. Can I come and meet you? And he says, yeah, can you come to, I said, where are you at? And he goes, I'm in Fresno, California. And I said, wow, well, right now I'm visiting family. I'm here in Fresno, too. And I said, where's your, because that's where I grew up in that area. And I said, where's your restaurant located? And he said, well, I'm on the corner of Shaw and Blackstone. And I said, wait a minute. I said, your restaurant wouldn't happen to be Ole Frijole, would it? And he goes, that's my restaurant. You know my restaurant? And I said, my parents have been taking me there since I was a little boy. I said, you still have all the soft serve you can eat? And he goes, yeah, we still have that. I go, it's legendary. He's like, yeah. So when I showed up to his restaurant that afternoon, I had 22 questions, because again, very naively thinking I'm going to get all 22 questions answered. You know, I've learned since then just to throw out all the questions and just go have conversations. But I had 22 questions because in my mind I thought, I have to prove he is who he says he is before I can write about him or do these things. Or we have to make sure he's one of the families. You know, so I kind of show up with this real sort of green vibe happening, and I get to his restaurant, I walk in, and there he's sitting there with his family on one of the tables, and he has splayed out across the entire table death certificates, birth certificates, photographs, newspaper articles. He'd been doing the research since he came as a 17-year-old boy from Mexico. And on that day, right before I left, he said, Mr. Hernandez, do you have a list of the names of the passengers? And I said, I do, but it's from the Hall of Records, and it's real messed up. Like some of the names aren't even spelled correctly, and there's only like half the names. It's a bad list. And he says, I have a list too. And I said, oh, can I see your list? And he says, sure, hold on. So he pulls out this envelope from his bag, and it's this old, tattered, yellowed, sepia, thin newspaper from the 40s. And he lays it out on the table. And it's a Spanish independent newspaper. And it says in Spanish, here are the names of all of the passengers killed. And I read that list, and it has the first, middle, and last name of every passenger. And then it says, here is the names of their surviving relatives. And it has the names of their mother, their father, their brother. And then it says, here's the last town in Mexico they lived. And then it says, here's the last known address that they lived at. And I told Mr. Ramirez, I don't have that list. I don't have that one. And I asked him, I said, what made you keep this list in your family all these, like, how did you get it? And what made you want to keep this list in your family? I don't understand, how did that, and then he just picked it up and he goes, we've been waiting for you. And he handed me that list. And that's the single shred of newspaper I've gone around for the last 15 years, 16 years looking for families and finding families with, is that one. And the Ramirez family is actually at some point, 2 different points, traveled with me back into Mexico looking for other families, knocking on doors with me. It's been an incredible journey, and we've been filming all of that the whole time. So it's, yeah, that's how that happened. Any other questions about the books, the process, or the film? It makes me cry. Yeah, it's a powerful story. I feel blessed to be on this journey. Go ahead. I said it in 2 books. The emotional arc is here. That's a pretty broad question. Do you want to ask it another way? That's maybe a little bit more pointed.
Your journey, you talked about your greenness at the beginning.
Yeah.
What did you learn about yourself?
Yeah, I think a lot. I think what I've learned, and this, I think what I've learned mostly is that family is what matters at the end of the day. I feel like that this was the families each carried their own message with me. I had to make meaning of that myself, of course, and I had to ask myself. That's why I wrote the second book, because after the first book, I thought, well, I kept it all about them, and then with audience questions, I began to sort of almost turn the lens on myself and go, well, I'm asking them all these hard questions. Where are those inside of my own journey, and it's taught me a lot about a lot of things that I thought mattered so much don't matter so much anymore. And and some of that just comes with getting older, I guess. But the details of all that are in the books. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it was completely unknown. The only memorialization, and I'm grateful for it, is the song. That song has, like I said, it's been played. It began with Pete Seeger, who first recorded it in 1961. And then every generation, Margot Price just recorded it recently. Roseanne Cash is singing it. Bruce Springsteen just sang it again. And so every time someone has sung it, that song's traveled around the world in different languages. There's people in France singing it. There's people in Italy singing the song. So it applies. It's pretty global, this song. So I'm grateful. I like to think of it as the song, as in the song, there's these lyrics that say, "Who are these friends all scattered like dry leaves? The radio says they're just deportees." And I like to think that it hung in the Akashic records long enough for the son and grandson of migrant farm workers to try and answer that question. Art has gravity, music, poetry, all of that, goes out further than any of us can ever go ourselves. It travels further. So grateful for that. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. You do it in community. Especially in film, right? If anyone's worked in film, it's the opposite spectrum of being a writer. A writer is just you and the blank page, And I got so accustomed to that and appreciative of that time. And then I had to go from that to understanding, oh, you have to have a team. to make a film. Like you have to have, and you have to hand it over to an editor. I mean, let me tell you, the first time I handed over the files, which were over 200 hours of footage in 16 years, to an editor, it was like giving away your baby. I was like, and so there was this level of trust and vulnerability in community, in sort of gathering a team. So for me, a lot of that, and again, that's also kind of how I wrote the books too. That time the team was the families themselves. But for me, I think that in any approach to any of this, it has to be in the community of this story, the people who are invested in it, the people who lived it, especially the people who've lived the stories. I can't see any way creating any form of art based on this story without the involvement of those folks, the folks who are involved in it. Many who I'm considered family for them now. They invite me to their weddings and quinceañeras and things like that. And so, I've stayed with their homes in Mexico and places like that. So just the involvement of a community, I think. Especially when we're writing about, let me just add this, when we're writing about an experience that isn't necessarily our own. I think that has to be written in community. It has to be written with certain permission, and involvement and inclusion. I think that's really important. And I'll just say that about that. Yeah, you had a question. Someone over here. It'll be done by this fall, early this fall, late September, early October. Yeah. Great. Please share that with me afterwards. Let me know. Yeah, I look forward to any of those kinds of leads and information. Yeah, the team we finally got together is a really great team of producers who have experience in other documentary films, and editors, and all the sort of post-production team. They're all much more experienced than I am in this, so they're working hard on it right now. Yes. Well, I'm not closed off to another book about it. I'd like to see this story expand in some other way, and what I mean by that is one of the first passengers I began looking for was the only female Mexican passenger who was killed. Her name was Maria Santana Rodriguez, and the report said she had baby clothes next to her body, like she had a bundle of baby clothes next to her. And that was always so intriguing. There were blue baby clothes. So I began by searching for her because I thought as the only female in the manifest, she'd probably be easiest to find. She wasn't. Years later, after the first book came out, the family found me. And her nephew, his name is Mike Rodriguez, he's an inner city school teacher, and he teaches ethnic studies. He teaches erasure. It's just incredible. Yeah, historical erasure. And he said, just recently he said, I think I'd like to write a book about my Aunt Maria. And I said, that would be powerful. So I love this idea of the story now expanding into other areas, other people who are involved, deciding to take up these sort of, singular approaches to the story versus this larger one. I'm open to that, and I told Mike, I'll help you, whatever you need. Let's make it happen. So those types of projects I'm excited about. It's expanding into, because now I've amassed a large archive, photographs, original photographs, newspaper articles, the first recording of this song by the college student who handed it to Pete Seeger himself. His family passed me this old recording of it, and it's just him in 1957 in his apartment in Fort Collins, Colorado, figuring out the song. So I have a lot of wonderful archives now from this, and the Woody Guthrie family has been really behind a lot of this effort. And they want to do an exhibit there at the Woody Guthrie Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So, yeah, and maybe possibly a traveling exhibit. So we're talking about those things. There's this really fun anecdote with Pete Seeger. I was living in Colorado at the time when I was early on in the search, and y'all know Pete Seeger? Okay, I know I'm in the right community, and so I didn't have to say that. But so a friend of mine who was a busker, he was there in Boulder, Colorado, just busking on the streets, and he said to me, and I pass by him all the time. I say, "Hey, Mark, what's going on?" Mark said to me one day, he's like, "Hey, man, I didn't know you were the guy who's looking for the deportees people." He's telling me on the street there, And I said, yeah, yeah. And he goes, I play that song all the time. Here, listen. And he starts playing it for me. And then he says, you should write to Pete Seeger. He'd probably want to know about this. Actually, he didn't even say Pete Seeger. He said, you should write to Pete. He'd probably want to know about this. And I'm like, which Pete? He's like, Pete Seeger. And I said, Pete Seeger's not going to read some letter. He responds, man. He likes his fan mail. I said, all right. So I write Pete Seeger a letter. And this is in 2013, like spring, February, or March, so around March. I write Pete Seeger a letter. I know he's like up there in age, 92 at this point or something. And I send it off to him in the mail with a copy of, the newspaper articles and things like that. So there it is. Months pass. I don't hear anything from Pete Seeger. Suddenly now it's October, and I'm in Brooklyn because of I'm in Manhattan because I'm there for the Brooklyn Book Festival for another book. And I'm walking up Manhattan, and all of a sudden my phone rings. And I do what, when you don't recognize the phone number, I do what everybody else here does. I just let it go to voicemail. Some people are like, I don't do that. I let it go to voicemail. And then the voicemail comes through, and I'm walking through Manhattan here. I'm not from New York. I'm living in Colorado during this moment in time. And I'm walking through Manhattan, and all of a sudden I check the voicemail, and it says, hi, this is Pete Seeger. I'm looking for Tim Hernandez. I got your lovely letter in the mail, and I'd like to talk to you about the plane crash at Los Gatos. If you're ever in New York, contact me. And I was like, are you kidding? So I call it right back. And he doesn't answer. His daughter answers. Long story short, she says, yeah, I'm going to arrange for my son to pick you up, Pete's grandson. I'll pick you up tomorrow here at this place. Meet him here. He's going to bring you to my father's house, and you can chat with him. Okay, great. So I'm there. I blow over like I'm supposed to be at the author's reception at the book festival. I'm supposed to be doing some things, book signing. And I'm like, nope, I'm going to see Pete Seeger. So I'm in the car, and his grandson the next morning is driving me to Beacon, New York, and we're going up there, and he's talking to me the whole time. And no, I have to tell you, because you all believe in synchronicity. So here's what happens. I walk into this building where I'm supposed to meet his grandson. And there's this guy who's walking towards me, and he's like smiling at me. I kind of recognize him, but my head's like a little, like I'm in New York, so I don't know anybody here. So this guy walks to me, and he's like, hey. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, Anthony Cody? He's a poet, he's a friend of mine. And he says, yeah, Anthony Cody's from my same small hometown near Fresno, California. And he sees me in New York City in this building, and he's laughing, and he hugs me. And I still don't understand what's happening. So I tell Anthony, hey, dude, listen, I want to catch up with you, but I got to go meet Pete Seeger. And he says, yeah, I'm going with you. And I went, what? And he's like, I'm going with you, bro. And I went, what do you mean? And he goes, so yesterday, check this out, Tim. So, I said, first of all, what are you doing here? He says, oh, I'm in the master's program at the university here. He's like, I've been here for a couple of years. I hadn't talked to him in a few years. And I said, wow. He says, here's what happened. Yesterday, I'm sitting down. I volunteer here at this little art center. I'm sitting here. My friend Kitama, which is Pete Seeger's grandson, answers the phone. His mom says, hey, Kitama, do you happen to know a guy named Tim Hernandez? He wants to interview Grandpa. And Kitama goes, no, I don't know no Tim Hernandez. And then Anthony goes, Tim Hernandez? Did you just say Tim Hernandez? And he goes, you know Tim Hernandez? He says, he's a poet from my hometown. You got to get him to go interview your grandfather. So he goes, yeah, Mom, I guess he's a known poet. And so he's going to, okay. That's how it happened that I end up in this car going to Pete Seeger's house with my friend Anthony Cody from my hometown. So we go up to meet Pete Seeger, and he's there, and Kitama tells me, his grandson says, my grandpa will either give you 5 hours or 5 minutes, you don't know. So just take whatever's there. I'd like to video, can I get you to say okay to video the interview with my grandfather? And I said, yeah, if I could use a copy at some point, maybe in a documentary years later. This was in 2013, and he says, yes, absolutely. So the whole 2.5 hours I sat there with Pete Seeger in an interview is all on video. And that was the last time Pete Seeger sang that song ever, was there with us in his living room. And then he passed away 3 months later. So yeah. I didn't have to. Pete passed the 5-minute mark himself. He loves telling stories. And at that time, I thought I was the only person he told all these stories to. And then later on in other documentaries, I saw, oh, he tells everyone that story. Those are his stories. Okay. Anyway, it's been an incredible journey. Yes? What am I going to do with them? I'd like to make them accessible eventually to everyone. I'm still working with them, but I'd like to make them accessible for the public. Oh, where are they at right now? Yeah, they're in my living room. My kid's already trained that if the house burns down, that's all you go for. Forget the family photos. You go for those archives. Yeah, I know. It's the brutal truth. Any final questions? I'm happy to take them. Well, I appreciate you all for being here, and I appreciate Fishtrap giving me the space. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all tonight at the reading. It's going to be a wonderful reading, powerful reading, so come on out, okay? Thank you. Thank you.
I can't wait to. I know Thank you. Our paths, the whole folk music scene, and because I was in the Woody Guthrie's American Song Touring Theater Act, and of course Deep RT was one of the spotlight things. I wasn't the singer of that song, but I was a musician. So yeah, so there's a lot of crossover there.